Break out your pocket watch and your paintbrushes. It's time for episode 3 of 10 Minutes to Better Painting. I am your coherent when edited host, Marco Bucci. You guys know by now how this works. Writer-director Andrew Stanton believes that the audience actually wants to work for their meal. They just don't want to know they're doing that. Episode 3 is about digital brushwork, which falls under the heading of music. In music, the possible notes we can play are very limited, but within them we can find unlimited variety. And in this episode, we'll explore how that's applicable to brushwork as well. Brushwork can almost be a dangerous thing to teach because it's a fertile area for expression, and expression by definition is personal. J.C. Leyendecker would rehearse his brushwork, and this page evinces his desire for every little element to be designed and beautiful. John Singer Sargent's almost countable brushstrokes gives us insight into the mind of a man who would stop at nothing in his quest for irreducible simplicity. And Jackson Pollock's manic spillages are nothing less than the emotions of a man living within a hair's breadth of his sanity. The point is, brushwork is where you announce who you are. Consider this, if you were to play your brushwork in Winamp, what would the music sound like? The takeaway here is the manipulation of paint impacts the viewer on an emotional level, and that is critically important. Okay, now let's talk digital brushwork. See, the challenge with digital painting is that your scores of traditional tools are essentially all replaced by simulated stamps. And while digital brushes do come in all shapes and sizes, and brush engines are getting more and more sophisticated, essentially what you're dealing with is a shape that gets repeated over and over and over. The human brain is exceptionally good at detecting repetition. Repetition kills variety, and variety is the thing we need to make compelling brushwork. And that is where I can help. Because while I would never tell you how your brushwork should look, I can point you towards areas that contain variety. I've got one word for you. Edges are like musical notes in the sense that there's a limited selection of them. In fact, I put edges into just 3 categories: hard, soft, lost. And here is the secret. Some objects have softer edges and other objects have harder edges. Huh? Oh, you know that secret already. Well, I not really took the wind out. But how about this? Have you considered that there are edges surrounding every object in the painting? Edges demanding attention around the perimeter of every brushstroke you make, and if you don't manage those edges properly, your painting will be boring, and mathematicians around the globe still cannot calculate the number of edges in a painting even of this moderate complexity? You can see where the challenge is. So here's a simple scene that will afford us a glimpse into creating variety with edge work. Now, at the moment, there's nothing but hard edges everywhere. There isn't any variety yet. I want some hard edges, but I certainly don't want them everywhere. Hard edges say to the viewer, I've resolved everything for you. There's no work for you to do here. Think of a hard edge as being like hitting someone over the head with a hammer. So I'll create our very first soft edge with an airbrush. But I don't like the digital airbrush. There's something sterile about it. The pointillist made soft edges by having little dots kind of bleed one shape into the next. And I have this ratty brush whose edge kind of looks like that. So what if I used that brush over top of my airbrush to add some variety to this edge? And hey, while I'm at it, I'll soften some edges that way in other areas too. A totally different way to soften an edge is using Photoshop's mixer brush. And because the mixer brush has a softer feel, I find it particularly effective against the more textured soft edges I have on there. Here I'm using a typical spatter brush, except I'm aiming it just at the edge. This gives me additional variety for how one shape can contaminate another shape. And I'll go ahead and try it out. All the while I'm doing the Winamp thing, and I'm trying to hear what the music is sounding like as I'm creating these edges. Our edges chart from earlier is actually drawn to scale. The soft edge area appears larger because I think in a painterly painting, you are mostly dealing in soft edges. And there are so many ways to make them. Here are just a few notes you can play with varieties of soft edge. Soft edges say, there's something here, but I've only given you part of the story. You're able to inject some of your own meaning here. I highly advise manipulating the edge around the silhouette of objects. Notice that Sargent's hand is not one consistent edge going all the way around. So here's our little example, which now has some hard and soft edges applied. Let's now move to lost edges. Lost edges are tantalizing. Lost edges are where you can no longer detect where one element ends and another begins. It's a mystery. Lost edges say, I've left this area unresolved. You have to do the work to make it meaningful. Back to our example, pay attention to these 2 areas. Those edges are going to pop from soft to lost in 3, 2, 1. Good. So you can see how just by working those edges, we can get some musical digital brushwork. Brushwork that makes the audience work for their meal and... can I help you, Mr. Stanton? Don't you think that's a little self-serving? Okay, fine. It's the Stanton principle. Can we just move on to part 2? So, in honor of brushwork, I'm going to do a painting of brushes in a studio. And I want to say right away that unlike the demo in part 1, where I started with hard edges and then got softer, I actually tend to work in the reverse way. I start with soft edges and progressively sculpt harder edges into it. Now that's just a personal choice, but I think it's because as you orchestrate edges, remember that hard edges really grab attention. So I like to put those in later when I know exactly where I want that attention to go. But that's later. Right now I'm switching my brush a lot and I'm making all kinds of different varieties of soft edge, like I showed you in part 1. I want as much interest pumped in there early, and then I can kind of sculpt with it. Now, here comes some brushes in these jars. And the brushes, there's probably going to be like 30 or 40 brushes in this painting, but I'm not going to paint them all with the same edge. I will be sure to use everything from hard to soft to lost edges in order to keep those elements in the painting very, very interesting. And that's because if I made hard edges everywhere, I'd lose a lot of intrigue and all the mystery would be gone. Everything would feel overly resolved and I'd lose your interest because there's no work for you to do. So I will use the Stanton principle to ensure that I'm giving you just enough so that you can complete the story. So what I like to do is try and give the viewer just enough hard edges, which again is kind of like hitting them over the head, just so they know exactly what some things are, and then they can extrapolate from there and kind of give context themselves to the softer edges and completely give their own context to the lost edges. But the point is, you need to use all of those edges in concert. If you don't, it'd be like playing the piano but only using one octave. It'd be too limited. So getting back to the painting process, I actually find that my paintings start very rapidly. I have a picture very early, but then it slows down pretty dramatically as I then have the workload of sculpting all these edges and orchestrating all these edges and relating all these edges. Actually, to me, edges are the subject, not just of this painting, of any painting I do. Doesn't matter what the literal subject is, a person, a robot, a fantasy scene, it doesn't matter. I still need to evoke that emotion on an abstract level, the brushwork level. So, you know, when I was first learning, it was all about the literal subject, but now I actually spend most of my time evaluating my painting on an abstract level. And there's a common question people have, it's when do you know your painting is done? For me, that answer is when I have thoroughly evaluated literally every square inch of that canvas. I know every brushstroke. Certain things may happen by chance. I'm not saying you should control everything, but even if something happens by chance, I need to understand that it's there and how it's affecting that music. In fact, if you go back to the beginning of this demonstration, I'm completely messing up the canvas with randomness, kind of like the visual equivalent of banging my fists on the piano. You know, producing notes at random, and then I'll find the order afterwards. Notice the particular styling of soft and lost edges in that photograph to make it look like a print rather than an actual person. And I'm at the point now where the painting could probably be called finished. I mean, certainly the drawing and values and color were there a while ago. And since then, it's been soften an edge here, harden an edge there, get a bit of variety here. This process could actually take another hour, but I've noticed that when I'm inching my way around the canvas like this, that's a pretty good indicator I'm finished, and I've learned to listen to that. Many digital artists take their brushwork woes to Google and think that downloading a good brush set will make their paintings better. And while that may sound reasonable, it is a logical fallacy. I love playing with new brushes too, but remember, no brush is going to accomplish the Stanton principle for you, and we don't want that, right? There are a million painting apps out there, but self-expression can only ever come from you. If you let the software take over, you're in danger of composing music by stamping the same note over and over. And that's the kind of self-expression that might lead to a more fulfilling role, at the DMV?